My name is Detective Marcus Thompson, and I've been working for the Seattle Police Department for 18 years. I've seen everything from petty theft to organized crime. But the case I'm about to tell you about started with something so ordinary that none of us could have predicted where it would lead. It was a rainy Thursday morning in March when dispatch called me about what seemed like a routine break-in report. Little did I know that this case would uncover one of the most disturbing criminal operations in the Pacific Northwest and change the lives of everyone involved. The call came in at 9:23 a.m. from a cleaning service company called Pristine Home Solutions. Their employee, Maria Santos, had been cleaning a house in the upscale Magnolia neighborhood when she discovered something that made her immediately call 911. The dispatcher's voice crackled through my radio. Unit 47. We have a possible breaking and entering at 2847 Elm Street. Cleaning lady found what appears to be a hidden room. She's requesting police presence immediately. I grabbed my coffee and headed out into the Seattle drizzle, thinking this was probably just an old servant's quarters or wine cellar that had been walled up during renovations. These old houses in Magnolia were full of architectural quirks from the early 1900s. But as I pulled up to the address, something felt off. The house was a beautiful craftsman-style home, probably worth close to $2 million, with perfectly manicured gardens and expensive cars in the driveway. Not the kind of place you'd expect to find anything suspicious. Maria Santos was waiting for me on the front porch, and I could see immediately that she was shaken. She was a small woman in her 50s, wearing the uniform of her cleaning company, and her hands were trembling as she clutched her phone. "Detective Thompson," I said, showing her my badge. "I understand you found something unusual." "See? Yes," she said, her accent thick with emotion. "I've been cleaning this house for 3 years, but today, today I found something that should not be there, something terrible." She led me through the front door into what was clearly an expensive, well-maintained home. Everything was pristine, from the hardwood floors to the designer furniture. The owners, she explained, were the Hendersons, Dr. Michael Henderson, a prominent surgeon, and his wife Catherine, who worked in real estate. They traveled frequently and had Maria come in twice a week to maintain the house. "They are good people," Maria said as we walked through the living room. "Always very nice to me, always pay on time. That's why this is so impossible to understand." We headed toward the back of the house, past a gourmet kitchen and into what appeared to be a home office. It was here that Maria had made her discovery. "I was dusting the bookshelf," she explained, pointing to a wall lined with expensive-looking books. "I noticed that one section felt different when I touched it, like it was not solid, so I pushed," and she demonstrated pressing against a particular section of the bookshelf. To my amazement, a portion of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow doorway that had been completely hidden behind the false bookcase. The opening was small, maybe 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, clearly designed to be concealed. "Have you been inside?" I asked Maria. She shook her head vigorously. No. I looked with my flashlight, but I did not go in. What I saw, it scared me very much." I pulled out my own flashlight and peered into the hidden space. What I saw made my blood run cold and immediately told me this was no longer a routine call. The hidden room was larger than it appeared from the outside. extending back about 12 feet and spanning the width of what would have been the office above. But it wasn't the size that made my stomach turn. It was what was inside. The walls were lined with photographs, hundreds of them, all showing the same subject: children, not family photos or school pictures, but surveillance-style shots taken from a distance. Kids playing in parks, walking to school, sitting in their yards. Each photo was carefully labeled with names, ages, addresses, and what appeared to be daily schedules. Jesus Christ, I muttered under my breath, immediately calling for backup and the crime scene unit. This was way beyond my expertise. I needed detectives from our Special Victims Unit here immediately. While I waited for backup, I did a preliminary sweep of the room without disturbing anything. There were filing cabinets filled with what appeared to be detailed dossiers on dozens of children throughout the Seattle area. A computer setup with multiple monitors. And most disturbing of all, a wall covered with what looked like a timeline or planning board, with photos connected by red string like something out of a conspiracy thriller. Maria had retreated to the living room, clearly traumatized by what she'd uncovered. I called my partner, Detective Sarah Kim, and filled her in on what we'd found. "Marcus, are you telling me we're looking at some kind of predator operation?" she asked. "It looks that way. This isn't just some guy with a few inappropriate photos. This is organized, systematic. We're talking about surveillance of dozens of kids, detailed planning, the works. I'm on my way. Don't let anyone else in that room until we get the crime scene text there." While I waited, I started thinking about the implications. Dr. Michael Henderson was a respected surgeon at Seattle Children's Hospital. His wife Catherine worked for one of the city's most prestigious real estate firms. They were pillars of the community, the kind of people you'd never suspect of being involved in anything like this. But the evidence was right there in their basement, hidden behind a bookshelf that had probably taken considerable time and money to construct. The crime scene unit arrived within 30 minutes, followed by Detective Kim and 2 specialists from our Special Victims Unit, Detective Lisa Rodriguez and Detective James Park. Rodriguez took one look at the hidden room and immediately called the FBI. "This is bigger than just Seattle," she said grimly. "If they're this organized, this systematic, they're probably part of a larger network." We spent the next 4 hours carefully documenting everything in the hidden room. The photographs alone, numbered in the hundreds, showing children from at least 6 different school districts in the Seattle area. The filing cabinets contained detailed information that could only have been gathered through extensive surveillance: which routes kids took to school, what time they got home, whether their parents worked, when they were typically alone. "Look at this," Detective Park called from the computer setup. "They've got spreadsheets tracking dozens of kids, schedules, vulnerabilities, family situations. This is like a hunting manual." The most chilling discovery was a series of folders labeled with dates going back 3 years. Each folder contained what appeared to be case studies of specific children with detailed plans for what they called acquisition opportunities. Some of the folders had red stamps that simply said, "Completed. We need to cross these names with missing children reports," Rodriguez said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "If what I think happened here actually happened, we're looking at one of the worst predator rings in the state's history." As the afternoon wore on, we began to piece together the scope of what we'd discovered. This wasn't just the work of one or to individuals. The level of organization, the sophisticated surveillance equipment, the detailed planning. This was a professional operation that had been running for years. "Where are the Hendersons now?" I asked Maria, who had been waiting patiently in the living room while we processed the scene. "They left for Europe last week," she said. "A medical conference in Switzerland," they said. "They're supposed to be gone for 2 weeks." Detective Kim and I exchanged glances. "Maria, I need you to think carefully. In the 3 years you've been cleaning this house, have you ever noticed anything unusual? People coming and going at odd hours? Strange sounds? Anything that seemed out of place?" Maria considered the question carefully. "There were sometimes meetings," she said slowly. "Always when I wasn't supposed to be there, but a few times I came early or stayed late. Men in expensive suits, very serious. They would go into the office and close the door. I thought it was just doctor business. How many men? Usually 3 or 4. Always the same ones. One was very tall, with gray hair. Another was younger, maybe 40, with a beard. They drove nice cars, Mercedes and BMW. We were dealing with something much larger than a single predator. This was an organized criminal enterprise, and the Hendersons were either the leaders or key players in a network that had been operating under everyone's noses for years. Back at the precinct, our task force had grown to include FBI agents, computer crimes specialists, and missing persons detectives from 3 different counties. The hidden room had yielded a treasure trove of evidence, but it also raised terrifying questions about how many children might have been victimized and how long this operation had been running. Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit took the lead on analyzing the computer equipment we'd seized. What she found made our worst fears seem optimistic. "They've got encrypted files going back at least 5 years," she reported to our task force. "We're talking about detailed surveillance of over 200 children in the greater Seattle area. But that's not the worst part." She pulled up a series of financial records on her laptop. They were selling information. This wasn't just about local predation. They were running a data mining operation, selling detailed profiles of vulnerable children to buyers across the country. The scope was staggering. The Hendersons and their associates had created what amounted to a catalog of potential victims, complete with photographs, schedules, family situations, and vulnerability assessments. They were selling this information to predators nationwide for thousands of dollars per profile. "Look at this," Detective Rodriguez said, pointing to a series of bank transfers on the screen. "They were making serious money. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in transactions over the past 2 years alone." But the financial records also gave us our first real leads. The money was coming from accounts all over the country, and each transaction was linked to specific child profiles. We could trace the buyers, and more importantly, we could identify which children might be in immediate danger. "We need to notify every family whose child appears in these files," Agent Walsh said, "and we need to do it fast. That we've discovered this operation. Anyone who bought information from them might accelerate their plans." The task of notifying families fell to Detective Kim and me, along with several other teams. It was the hardest part of any case I'd ever worked, calling parents to tell them that their child had been under surveillance by predators, that detailed information about their daily routines had been sold to criminals across the country. Our first call was to the Morrison family. Their 8-year-old daughter Emma had one of the thickest files in the Henderson collection. "Mr. Morrison, this is Detective Thompson with the Seattle Police Department. I need to speak with you and your wife about your daughter's safety. Can you both be home in the next hour?" The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Mr. Morrison finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Is Emma okay? Where is she right now?" "Sir, Emma is fine, but we need to talk to you immediately about some threats that have come to our attention." The Morrison family lived in a modest house in the Ballard neighborhood. When Kim and I arrived, both parents were waiting at the door, their faces pale with worry. We sat them down in their living room and explained as gently as possible what we'd discovered. "Your daughter has been under surveillance by a criminal organization," I said. "We found detailed information about her daily routines, her school schedule, times when she's typically alone. This information was being sold to predators across the country." Mrs. Morrison broke down immediately. "How is this possible? How did they get this information? We're careful. We watch her. "Ma'am, this wasn't your fault," Detective Kim said softly. "These people were professionals. They used sophisticated surveillance techniques. The important thing now is that we've stopped them and we're working to protect Emma and other children who were targeted." We spent an hour with the Morrisons, explaining the security measures they needed to take and arranging for increased police patrols in their neighborhood. It was a conversation we would have dozens of times over the next few days, each one more heartbreaking than the last. Meanwhile, the FBI was working to track down the buyers of the Hendersons' information, spanning from California to New York, all connected through encrypted communications and cryptocurrency transactions. We've identified at least 30 individuals who purchased detailed profiles from this operation, Agent Walsh reported. We're coordinating with field offices across the country to make simultaneous arrests. This is going to be one of the largest predator roundups in FBI history. But there was still one crucial piece missing: the Hendersons themselves. They had left for Switzerland the week before Maria discovered the hidden room, and their travel plans were proving to be more complicated than we'd initially thought. Their flight records show they flew to Zurich, Detective Rodriguez reported, but after that, the trail goes cold. No hotel reservations under their names, no credit card activity, no phone usage. It's like they disappeared. "They knew," I said grimly. "Somehow they knew we were getting close, and they ran." The question was, how did they know? Had they been tipped off by someone in law enforcement? Was there a leak in our investigation? Or had they simply gotten spooked by something and decided to disappear before their operation was discovered? As our investigation expanded, we began to understand that the Henderson operation was just one node in a much larger network. The FBI's analysis of their communications revealed connections to similar operations in Portland, San Francisco, and Denver. We weren't just dealing with a local predator ring. We were looking at a nationwide criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. "They call themselves the Collectors," Agent Walsh explained during our morning briefing. "Based on the encrypted communications we've decrypted, they see themselves as providing a service to what they call discerning clients. They're not just predators, they're businessmen who've turned child exploitation into a sophisticated commercial operation." The more we learned about the Collectors, the more disturbing it became. They had developed a rating system for children based on vulnerability factors, single-parent homes, working parents, kids who walked to school alone, families going through divorces. They had scouts in multiple cities who would identify potential targets and gather intelligence. "Look at this organizational chart we've pieced together," Detective Park said, pointing to a whiteboard covered with photos and connecting lines. "Dr. Henderson appears to be what they call a regional coordinator. He was responsible for the entire Pacific Northwest operation. His wife, Catherine, used her real estate connections to identify families and gather intelligence about their situations. The real estate angle was particularly clever. Catherine Henderson had access to detailed information about families' financial situations, work schedules, and personal circumstances through her job. She knew which families were struggling financially, which parents worked long hours, which homes had security systems. She was essentially conducting reconnaissance under the cover of legitimate business. We've identified at least 12 other real estate agents across the country who appear to be part of this network," Agent Walsh continued. "They're using their professional access to gather intelligence on families, then passing that information up the chain to coordinators like the Hen. But the network went even deeper than real estate. We discovered connections to school employees, youth sports coaches, and even some medical professionals. Anyone who had regular access to children and their families was a potential asset for the collectors. This is how they stayed under the radar for so long," Detective Rodriguez observed. "They weren't random predators grabbing kids off the street. They were using legitimate professional relationships to gather intelligence and identify opportunities. It's sophisticated, organized, and absolutely terrifying." The breakthrough in finding the Hendersons came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, the cleaning lady who had discovered the hidden room, remembered something that had seemed insignificant at the time. "There was a phone call," she told us during a follow-up interview. "About 2 weeks ago, when I was cleaning upstairs, Dr. Henderson was in his office, and I heard him talking very loudly, very angry. He kept saying something about the Seattle situation and moving up the timeline. Did you hear anything else?" Detective Kim asked. "He mentioned a name, Victor, and something about the Swiss account. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now." The name Victor led us to Viktor Kozlov, a Russian businessman with connections to money laundering operations across Europe. Financial records showed that the Hendersons had been moving money through a series of shell companies connected to Kozlov's network. "They've been planning their escape for months," Agent Walsh said grimly. "The Swiss bank accounts, the shell companies, the timing of their trip. This wasn't a panic move. They knew this day would come eventually, and they prepared for it. But their preparation wasn't perfect. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit was able to trace some of their transactions and freeze several accounts. More importantly, they identified a pattern in the money movements that suggested the Hendersons were planning to settle in a non-extradition country. Based on the financial trail and some intercepted communications, we believe they're heading for Belarus," Agent Walsh reported. "Kozlov has connections there, and it's one of the few countries that doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States." While the FBI worked on tracking down the Hendersons, our local task force was dealing with the aftermath of their operation. We had identified 47 children in the Seattle area who had been under active surveillance, and we were in the process of notifying all their families and implementing protection measures. The psychological impact on the families was devastating. Parents who had thought their children were safe in their own neighborhoods suddenly realized they had been watched, studied, and targeted by sophisticated criminals. Many families decided to move, change schools, or take other drastic measures to protect their children. The worst part is the violation of trust, said Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a child psychologist we brought in to help counsel the affected families. These children and their parents trusted their community, their schools, their neighbors. Now they're learning that predators had infiltrated those trusted spaces and were using them to gather intelligence. The case was also having a broader impact on the community. News of the Collectors Network had leaked to the media, and parents across Seattle were demanding answers about how such an operation could have gone undetected for so long. We're reviewing all our protocols for background checks and community partnerships, Police Chief Robert Anderson announced at a press conference. We're also working with schools, youth organizations, and other community groups to implement new safety measures and awareness programs. But even as we worked to address the local impact, the national scope of the investigation continued to expand. FBI field offices across the country were making arrests based on the intelligence we'd gathered from the Henderson house. In 3 days, they had arrested 23 individuals in 12 states, all connected to the Collectors Network. The search for Dr. Michael and Catherine Henderson had become an international manhunt involving law enforcement agencies across 3 continents. The FBI had issued red notices through Interpol, and financial investigators were tracking their movements through a complex web of offshore accounts and shell companies. We've confirmed they made it to Belarus, Agent Walsh reported during our daily briefing. But here's where it gets interesting. They're not staying put. Our intelligence suggests they're moving frequently, probably using false identities that were prepared well in advance. The Hendersons had clearly spent years preparing for this scenario. Financial records showed they had been moving money offshore since 2019, well before we had any indication that their operation existed. They had established multiple identities, safe houses in several countries, and a network of contacts who could help them stay hidden. This level of preparation suggests they were either extremely paranoid or they knew their operation was high risk, Detective Kim observed. Either way, they were planning their escape long before Maria Santos found that hidden room. But their careful planning had one weakness: their need to maintain contact with other members of the Collectors Network. The FBI's Cybercrimes Unit was monitoring all known communication channels used by the organization, and they had detected several encrypted messages that appeared to originate from the Hendersons' location. They're still trying to run the operation, Agent Walsh explained. Even from hiding, they're attempting to coordinate with other cells and manage the network. That's going to be their downfall. The messages were heavily encrypted, but the FBI's cryptographers were making progress in breaking the codes. What they found was evidence that the Collectors Network was much larger than we had initially realized. With active operations in at least 15 countries, we're looking at a global criminal enterprise, Agent Walsh said grimly. The Seattle operation was just one small piece of a worldwide network that's been trafficking in information about vulnerable children for years. The international scope of the investigation brought new challenges. Different countries had different laws about child protection, different extradition treaties, and different levels of cooperation with U.S. law enforcement. Some countries were fully cooperative, while others were reluctant to get involved in what they saw as an American problem. We're working through diplomatic channels to ensure that all countries understand the scope of this threat, Agent Walsh explained. This isn't just about American children. The Collectors Network has been operating globally, and children in every country are at risk. Meanwhile, back in Seattle, we were dealing with the ongoing impact of the investigation on the local community. The discovery of the Collectors Network had shaken parents' confidence in their ability to protect their children, and many were demanding more aggressive action from law enforcement. People want to know how this could happen, Chief Anderson said during a community meeting in the Magnolia neighborhood where the Hendersons had lived. They want to know how sophisticated criminals could operate in their neighborhood for years without being detected. The answer was uncomfortable but important for the community to understand. The Hendersons had been model citizens, on the surface, respected professionals, active in community organizations, generous donors to local charities. They had used their legitimate status to gain access to information and build trust with families. This is how sophisticated predators operate, I explained to the community meeting. They don't look like the stereotypical stranger with candy. They're often respected members of the community who use their status and professional access to identify and target victims. The community response was a mix of anger, fear, and determination. Parents organized new safety programs, schools implemented additional security measures, and neighborhood watch groups became more active. But there was also a sense of violation that would take time to heal. It's not just about the children who were directly targeted, Dr. Martinez explained. The entire community has been traumatized by the realization that predators were operating in their midst, using their trust and access to gather intelligence on their families. The psychological impact extended beyond Seattle. As news of the Collectors Network spread nationally, parents across the country began questioning their own community's safety. Were there other operations like this in other cities? How many children had been victimized by this network? How many other networks might be operating undetected? We're seeing a national conversation about child safety that's long overdue, said Dr. Sarah Williams, a child protection expert who had been following our investigation. The Collectors case has exposed vulnerabilities in our systems that most people never realized existed. The FBI was working to address these concerns by expanding their investigation to look for similar operations in other cities. They were also developing new protocols for detecting and disrupting organized predator networks before they could become as sophisticated as the Collectors. We're treating this as a wake-up call, Agent Walsh said. The Collectors Network shows us what's possible when predators organize and use technology to their advantage. We need to be equally sophisticated in our response. Our breakthrough in tracking the Hendersons came from an unexpected source, a Swiss banking whistleblower who had been monitoring suspicious transactions for months before our investigation began. Hans Mueller, a compliance officer at a private bank in Zurich, had noticed unusual patterns in several accounts connected to shell companies with ties to the United States. I had been tracking these accounts since early 2022, Mueller explained during a secure video conference with our task force. Large sums of money were being moved in patterns that suggested money laundering, but the amounts were not large enough to trigger automatic reporting requirements. Muller's bank had been unknowingly facilitating the collector's financial operations for years. The Hendersons and their associates had been using a sophisticated network of shell companies to move money through Swiss accounts, then transferring it to other offshore locations to fund their operations and prepare for eventual escape. They were very clever about staying under the radar, Mueller continued. No single transaction was large enough to raise red flags, but when you looked at the pattern over time, it was clear that this was organized criminal activity. The Swiss authorities were now fully cooperating with our investigation, providing detailed financial records that helped us understand the full scope of the collector's operations. What we found was staggering. Over 3.2 million Hadberfed represent etched chilled profibulis, $5,000 and $15,000. Depending on the level of detail and perceived vulnerability, Agent Walsh explained. They had created a marketplace for child exploitation that was generating serious money. But the financial records also gave us our best lead yet on the Hendersons' current location. Recent transactions showed they had been accessing funds from accounts in 3 different countries: Belarus, Moldova, and Serbia. The pattern suggested they were moving frequently, probably trying to stay ahead of law enforcement. "They're running scared," Detective Rodriguez observed. "The fact that they're moving this frequently means they know we're closing in." The international cooperation was unprecedented. Law enforcement agencies in 12 countries were now actively involved in the manhunt, sharing intelligence and coordinating efforts to track down not just the Hendersons, but the entire collectors network. "We've never seen this level of international cooperation on a child exploitation case," Agent Walsh said. "Countries that normally don't work well together are putting aside their differences because everyone understands the threat this network represents." The cooperation was paying off. In the past week, authorities in 6 countries had made arrests of individuals connected to the collectors network. Each arrest provided new intelligence that helped us understand the organization's structure and identify additional targets. In Germany, police arrested Klaus Weber, a youth sports coach who had been providing detailed information about children in his programs. In Australia, authorities detained Sarah Chen, a school administrator who had been using her access to student records to identify vulnerable children. In Canada, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrested David Thompson, a pediatric nurse who had been gathering intelligence on patients and their families. Each arrest is like pulling a thread that unravels more of the network, Detective Park explained. These people were all connected through encrypted communications, and each one we catch gives us access to more of their communications and contacts. But the most significant breakthrough came when German authorities arrested Viktor Kozlov, the Russian businessman who had been facilitating the network's financial operations. Kozlov had been traveling on a false passport when he was detained at Frankfurt Airport, apparently trying to reach the Hendersons with new identity documents. "Kozlov is talking," Agent Walsh reported with barely contained excitement. "He's providing detailed information about the collector's operations in exchange for a plea deal. And he's confirmed that the Hendersons are still alive and still trying to run the network from hiding." According to Kozlov, the Hendersons were becoming increasingly desperate as law enforcement closed in on their operation. They had been pressuring other network members to accelerate their activities and generate more revenue before the entire organization was shut down. They're trying to cash out, Agent Walsh explained. They know their time is limited, so they're pushing for as many transactions as possible before they have to completely disappear. This desperation was creating opportunities for law enforcement. The increased activity was generating more communications traffic, more financial transactions, and more chances for the Hendersons to make mistakes that could reveal their location. Desperate criminals make sloppy criminals, Detective Kim observed. The more pressure they feel, the more likely they are to do something that gives them away. The pressure was also having an impact on other members of the collectors' network. Several individuals had attempted to surrender to authorities in exchange for leniency, providing valuable intelligence about the organization's operations and structure. The network is collapsing, Agent Walsh said, as more members are arrested and others try to cut deals. The remaining members are losing confidence in the organization's ability to protect them. But even as the collectors' network crumbled, the investigation was revealing the full scope of the damage they had caused. Hundreds of children across multiple countries had been under surveillance, and dozens of families had been victimized by predators who had purchased information from the network. As our investigation progressed, we began to understand the true human cost of the collectors' network. It wasn't just about the children who had been under surveillance. It was about the families whose lives had been forever changed by the knowledge that predators had been watching their children, studying their routines, and planning potential attacks. Detective Kim and I were assigned to work with the Victim Services Unit to interview families and assess the ongoing threat to children who had been targeted. It was the most difficult part of the investigation, but also the most important. These families deserved to know what had happened, and we needed their cooperation to build the strongest possible case against the collectors' network. Our first interview was with the Johnson family. Their 10-year-old son Tyler had been under surveillance for over a year, and his profile had been sold to at least 3 different predators across the country. "We thought we were being careful," Mrs. Johnson said, tears streaming down her face. "Tyler walked to school with friends. We had security systems. We taught him about stranger danger. How were we supposed to know that someone was watching him from a distance, taking pictures, learning his schedule?" The Johnsons' story was heartbreakingly typical. They were a normal, middle-class family who had done everything they thought was necessary to keep their child safe. But the collectors had identified Tyler as a target because he was often alone for short periods after school while his parents were still at work. "They knew exactly when Tyler got home from school," Mr. Johnson said, his voice shaking with anger. "They knew he had 30 minutes alone before his babysitter arrived. They knew which days he had soccer practice and which route he took to the field. They knew everything about our family's routine." The psychological impact on Tyler was significant. Even though he had never been physically harmed, the knowledge that strangers had been watching him and planning to hurt him had left him anxious and fearful. He was having trouble sleeping, didn't want to walk to school anymore, and was afraid to be alone even for short periods. "He keeps asking if the bad people are still watching him," Mrs. Johnson said. "We've tried to explain that the police caught them, but he's just a 10-year-old boy. He doesn't understand why anyone would want to hurt him." Dr. Martinez, the child psychologist working with our task force, explained that this type of psychological trauma was common among children who had been targeted by predators, even if They were never physically harmed. The violation of safety and privacy can be just as traumatic as physical abuse, she said. These children have learned that the world is not as safe as they thought. And that's a very difficult thing for a young mind to process. We interviewed dozens of families over the following weeks, and each story was similar. Normal families, living normal lives, unaware that sophisticated criminals were studying their children and selling information about them to predators across the country. The geographic spread of the victims was particularly disturbing. The collectors hadn't focused on any particular neighborhood or demographic. They had targeted children from all backgrounds, all income levels, all family structures. The only common factor was vulnerability. Children who were alone at predictable times, families with busy schedules, situations where a predator might have an opportunity to approach a child without being immediately detected. They were looking for windows of opportunity, Agent Walsh explained. Times and places where a child might be isolated and vulnerable, even if only for a few minutes. Some of the most heartbreaking cases involved children who had actually been approached by predators who had purchased their information from the collectors network. 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez had been followed home from school by a man who knew her name, her address, and her family's schedule. He had approached her in her own front yard, claiming to be a friend of her parents. He knew too much about our family, Mrs. Rodriguez said. He knew that Emma's father worked late on Thursdays. He knew that I usually got home from work at 5:30. He knew that Emma had a dog named Buddy. Emma thought he must be telling the truth about knowing us. Fortunately, Emma had been taught to never go anywhere with strangers, regardless of what they claimed to know about her family. She had run into the house and locked the door, then called her mother at work. The man had disappeared by the time police arrived, but security cameras in the neighborhood had captured his image. We later identified him as Robert Martinez, a convicted child molester from California who had purchased Emma's profile from the collectors network. Detective Rodriguez reported. He had driven over 1,000 miles specifically to target Emma based on the information he had bought. Martinez was now in custody, facing federal charges for interstate travel with intent to commit a crime against a child. His arrest had led to the discovery of detailed plans to abduct Emma and transport her to a remote location in Nevada. This shows how close we came to having actual abductions, Agent Walsh said grimly. The collectors network wasn't just gathering information for curiosity. They were providing intelligence that predators were using to plan actual crimes against children. The realization that some predators had come so close to successfully abducting children based on information from the collectors network added urgency to our efforts to track down the Hendersons and shut down the remaining parts of the organization. Every day they remain free is another day that children are at risk, Detective Kim said. We know they're still trying to operate the network from hiding, which means they're still selling information to predators who might act on it. The victim interviews also provided valuable intelligence for our investigation. Several families remembered seeing suspicious individuals in their neighborhoods around the times when their children were under surveillance. Others recalled unusual incidents, strangers asking questions about their families, people taking photographs in areas where children played, vehicles that seemed to be following school buses. The collectors network required extensive surveillance to gather the detailed information they were selling. Agent Walsh explained. That surveillance left traces, and the victim families are helping us identify those traces and build a more complete picture of how the network operated. This information was being used to identify additional members of the collectors' network who had been involved in surveillance activities. In several cases, we were able to match descriptions provided by families to individuals who had been arrested in other parts of the country, helping to build stronger cases against the entire organization. The breakthrough that would ultimately lead us to the Hendersons came from the digital forensics team that had been analyzing the computer equipment seized from their hidden room. What they discovered was a sophisticated communication system that the collectors had been using to coordinate their global operations. They thought they were being clever with their encryption, said Special Agent David Chen, the FBI's lead computer crimes investigator on the case. But they made one critical mistake. They reused certain code patterns across multiple communications, which gave us a way to identify and decrypt their messages. The decrypted communications revealed the full scope of the collectors' network. In stunning detail, there were active cells in 23 countries, with over 200 individuals involved in various aspects of the operation. The network had been generating over $10 million annually by selling detailed profiles of vulnerable, ill children to predators worldwide. This wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a multinational corporation dedicated to child exploitation, Agent Walsh said during our briefing. They had regional managers, quality control procedures, customer service protocols, even performance bonuses for members who provided particularly valuable intelligence. The communications also revealed that the Hendersons were indeed still trying to run the network from hiding. They had been sending encrypted messages to remaining cell leaders, trying to maintain operations while law enforcement closed in on the organization. They're like CEOs trying to run a company while on the run from the law, Agent Chen explained. They can't resist trying to maintain control over their operation, and that's giving us opportunities to track them. The most significant discovery was a series of messages indicating that the Hendersons were planning to meet with other high-level network members at a location in Eastern Europe. The messages were heavily coded, but the forensics team was able to identify references to a specific date and what appeared to be coordinates for a location in Romania. They're getting desperate, Detective Rodriguez observed. They know their network is collapsing, and they're trying to organize some kind of emergency meeting to salvage what they can. The FBI immediately began coordinating with Romanian authorities to set up surveillance at the suspected meeting location. It was a remote compound in the Carpathian Mountains that had been purchased through one of the collectors' shell companies 2 years earlier. This could be our chance to not only capture the Hendersons, but to take down the remaining leadership of the entire network, Agent Walsh said. If we can catch them all in one place, we can effectively destroy the collectors as an organization. But the operation would be extremely complex. Romanian law enforcement would need to coordinate with multiple international agencies, and there was always the risk that the suspects would detect the surveillance and flee before the meeting could take place. We're dealing with sophisticated criminals who have been evading law enforcement for months, Agent Walsh explained. They're paranoid, well-funded, and have multiple escape plans. We'll only get one chance at this. While the international task force prepared for the potential operation in Romania, Our local team continued working with the families who had been victimized by the collectors network. The psychological support services were ongoing, and many families were still struggling to cope with the knowledge that their children had been targeted. "It's not something you ever fully get over," said Dr. Martinez. "These families have had their sense of safety and security permanently altered. Even after the criminals are caught, the fear and anxiety can persist for years." Some families had decided to relocate, changing jobs and schools to start fresh in new communities, where they felt their children would be safer. Others had chosen to stay, but had implemented extensive security measures, new alarm systems, changed routines, constant supervision of their children. The impact on these families extends far beyond the immediate threat. Dr. Martinez continued. Children who were targeted are showing signs of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. Parents are struggling with guilt, wondering if they could have done something differently to protect their children. The community response had been overwhelmingly supportive. Local businesses had donated money for security upgrades for affected families. Schools had implemented new safety protocols and hired additional security personnel. Neighborhood watch groups had expanded their activities and increased their vigilance. This case has brought the community together in ways we've never seen before, said Chief Anderson. People understand that this threat could have affected any family, and they're working together to make sure it never happens again. The media attention had also been intense. The story of the Collectors Network had made national news, and reporters from around the world were covering the investigation. While the attention helped raise awareness about the threat of organized predator networks, it also created challenges for the investigation. "We have to be careful about what information we release," Agent Walsh explained. "Too much publicity could alert remaining network members and help them evade capture. We need to balance public awareness with operational security." The international cooperation continued to expand as more countries recognized the global threat posed by the Collectors Network. Law enforcement agencies that had never worked together before were sharing intelligence and coordinating operations to track down network members and protect potential victims. This case has changed how we think about international cooperation on child exploitation cases, said Agent Walsh. "We're seeing unprecedented levels of coordination between agencies that traditionally haven't worked well together." The success of the international cooperation was evident in the continued arrests of network members. In the past month, authorities in 8 countries had arrested 34 individuals connected to the collectors, effectively dismantling most of the organization's operational capacity. "We've cut off most of their revenue streams and arrested most of their operational personnel," Agent Walsh reported. "The Hendersons and a few other high-level leaders are essentially trying to run a criminal organization that no longer exists." The operation in Romania was set to be the largest international law enforcement action in the history of child exploitation cases. Authorities from 12 countries were coordinating to simultaneously raid the mountain compound where the collectors' leadership was planning to meet, while also conducting arrests of remaining network members across multiple continents. "We're calling it Operation Safe Haven," Agent Walsh explained during the final briefing before the raids. "The goal is to completely destroy the collectors' network in a single coordinated action that will prevent any remaining members from escaping." or reorganizing. The Romanian compound was located in a remote area of the Carpathian Mountains, accessible only by a single mountain road that wound through dense forest. Satellite imagery showed a large main building surrounded by several smaller structures, all enclosed by a high fence with security cameras and motion sensors. They chose this location specifically because it's defensible and isolated, explained Colonel Andrei Popescu of the Romanian Special Operations Forces, who was leading the tactical operation. But that isolation also works in our favor. Once we control the access road, there's nowhere for them to run. The intelligence gathered from the decrypted communications indicated that at least 6 high-level collectors leaders would be at the compound, including the Hendersons. The meeting was scheduled to begin at sunset on a Friday evening, giving the tactical teams the advantage of approaching under cover of darkness. We'll have teams positioned on the mountain ridges surrounding the compound, Colonel Popescu continued. Thermal imaging shows there are currently 8 individuals inside the main building, which matches our intelligence about expected attendance. The international coordination was unprecedented. In addition to the Romanian operation, law enforcement teams in 11 other countries were preparing to simultaneously arrest remaining collectors' network members at exactly the same time, preventing anyone from warning the leadership about the raids. The timing has to be perfect, Agent Walsh stressed. If anyone gets word that we're moving against the network, the people at the compound could escape or destroy evidence. We get one shot at this. Detective Kim and I were part of the international observer team that would monitor the operation. From a command post several miles from the compound, it was frustrating not to be directly involved in the arrest of the Hendersons after months of investigation. But the Romanian authorities were handling the tactical operation with military precision. These are the people who destroyed so many families, Detective Kim said as we watched the tactical teams prepare for the assault. After everything we've seen, everything those children and their families have been through, it's hard to believe we're finally going to get them. The operation began at 11:47 p.m. local time. Romanian Special Forces teams approached the compound from 3 different directions, using night vision equipment and thermal imaging to track the movements of the individuals inside. The initial approach was completely silent. The teams reached the perimeter fence without being detected by the compound's security systems. Breach teams are in position, Colonel Popescu reported over the radio. All targets appear to be in the main building. We have positive identification of at least 6 individuals, including 2 matching the descriptions of the Henderson subjects. The breach happened simultaneously from multiple entry points. Flashbang grenades disabled the occupants, while tactical teams swarmed into the building from 3 different directions. Within 90 seconds, all 8 individuals in the compound had been secured without a single shot being fired. All targets in custody, came the report over the radio. No injuries to suspects or officers. We have positive identification of Michael and Catherine Henderson. The relief in the command post was palpable. After months of international manhunt, the leaders of the Collectors Network were finally in custody. But the operation was far from over. Law enforcement teams around the world were simultaneously conducting their own raids. In the next 6 hours, authorities in 11 countries arrested 47 individuals connected to the Collectors Network. The coordinated operation effectively destroyed the entire organization in a single night, capturing not only the leadership but also most of the remaining operational members. This is the largest coordinated action against an international child exploitation network in history, Agent Walsh announced during a press conference the following morning. We have effectively dismantled an organization that was responsible for putting hundreds of children at risk across multiple continents. The evidence seized during the raids was staggering. In addition to the Hendersons and other leaders, authorities had captured detailed records of the network's operations, financial accounts containing millions of dollars, and communication equipment that would provide intelligence about other potential threats to children. We found evidence of plans to expand their operations into new countries and develop even more sophisticated surveillance techniques, Agent Walsh reported. The collectors weren't just maintaining their current operations, they were actively working to grow their network and increase the threat to children worldwide. The arrest of the Hendersons was particularly satisfying for our Seattle team. These were the people whose hidden room had started our entire investigation, whose sophisticated operation had terrorized families throughout our community. They thought they were untouchable, Detective Rodriguez said. They thought their money and their international connections would keep them safe. But they underestimated the determination of law enforcement agencies around the world to protect children. The Hendersons were immediately extradited to the United States to face federal charges. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Not only did we have the physical evidence from their hidden room, but we also had financial records, communications, and testimony from other network members who had agreed to cooperate with authorities. They're looking at life in prison without the possibility of parole, Agent Walsh said. The charges include conspiracy to exploit children, money laundering, racketeering, and multiple counts of endangering the welfare of children. There's no scenario where they ever see freedom again. The trial of Dr. Michael Henderson and Catherine Henderson began 6 months after their arrest in Romania, and it quickly became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in recent memory. The federal courthouse in Seattle was surrounded by media from around the world, and security was unprecedented due to the international scope of the case and the number of victims involved. This trial represents more than just the prosecution of 2 individuals, said U.S. Attorney Margaret Stevens during her opening statement. This is about holding accountable the leaders of a criminal organization that systematically targeted children for exploitation and profit. The evidence will show that the defendants were not just participants in this network, they were architects of a system designed to put children in danger. The prosecution's case was built on the overwhelming evidence we had gathered during our investigation: the hidden room in the Henderson house, the detailed surveillance files on hundreds of children, the financial records showing millions of dollars in transactions, and the communications proving their leadership role in the collectors network. The defendants will try to claim they were just small players in a larger organization, Prosecutor James Wilson told the jury. But the evidence will show that they were regional coordinators responsible for operations across the entire Pacific Northwest. They were the ones making decisions about which children to target, how to gather intelligence, and how to sell that information to predators. The defense strategy was predictable but desperate. The Hendersons' attorneys argued that their clients had been coerced into participating in the network by more powerful criminal organizations, and that they had been trying to extract themselves from the operation when they were arrested. My clients are victims, too, defense attorney Robert Chen argued. They became involved with dangerous people who threatened their lives and their families if they didn't cooperate. They were trying to escape from this situation when they were arrested in Romania, but the evidence contradicted every aspect of the defense's claims. The communications we had decrypted showed the Hendersons actively planning and coordinating network operations. The financial records showed them profiting significantly from the sale of children's information and testimony from other network members revealed them to be enthusiastic participants who had helped design many of the organization's most sophisticated surveillance techniques. Detective Kim and I were among the first witnesses called by the prosecution. We testified about discovering the hidden room, the scope of the evidence we had found, and the impact on the families whose children had been targeted. The level of detail in the surveillance files was extraordinary, I testified. These weren't random photographs taken from a distance. These were comprehensive intelligence profiles that included children's daily schedules, family situations, vulnerabilities, and detailed plans for potential approaches. The most powerful testimony came from the families whose children had been targeted by the collectors network. One by one, parents took the stand to describe the impact on their families and their children. "My daughter still has nightmares," testified Mrs. Johnson, whose son Tyler had been under surveillance for over a year. "She's afraid to walk to school, afraid to play in our own yard, afraid that someone is watching her. The defendants stole my child's sense of safety and security." The international scope of the case was demonstrated through video testimony from victims and law enforcement officials in multiple countries, families from Canada, Australia, Germany, and other countries described how their children had been targeted by the network and how the information gathered by the Hendersons had been used to facilitate surveillance and attempted approaches in their home countries. "This network had no borders," testified Detective Inspector Sarah Williams of the London Metropolitan Police via video link. "Children in our jurisdiction were being targeted based on intelligence gathered by the defendants in Seattle. This was truly a global threat to child safety." The financial evidence was particularly damning. Forensic accountants testified that the Hendersons had received over $800,000 in payments from the sale of children's information over a 3-year period. They had used this money to fund their lavish lifestyle while also preparing for their eventual escape from law enforcement. They were profiting from putting children in danger, testified FBI financial crimes specialist, Agent Lisa Park. Every transaction represented a child whose safety had been compromised for money. The technology evidence was equally compelling. Computer forensics experts explained how the Hendersons had used sophisticated surveillance equipment and communication systems to coordinate their operations and communicate with other network members around the world. They had created a professional-grade intelligence operation, testified Agent Chen. The level of technical sophistication was comparable to what we see in corporate espionage or national security cases. This wasn't amateur hour. This was a highly organized criminal enterprise. As the prosecution presented its case, the full scope of the collectors network became clear to the jury. This wasn't just about the Hendersons. It was about a global criminal organization that had systematically targeted children for exploitation, using sophisticated technology and professional intelligence-gathering techniques to maximize their profits while minimizing their risk of detection. The defendants weren't just criminals, Prosecutor Stevens said during her closing argument. They were entrepreneurs who saw children as commodities to be studied, cataloged, and sold to the highest bidder. They turned child exploitation into a business model, and they profited handsomely from putting hundreds of children at risk. The defense's closing argument was a desperate attempt to minimize the Hendersons' role in the network and generate sympathy for their situation. But after weeks of overwhelming evidence, it was clear that the jury wasn't buying their claims of victimhood. These are not victims, Prosecutor Wilson said in his rebuttal. These are predators who used their professional status and community standing to gain access to children and their families. They violated the trust that parents placed in them, and they put children in danger for profit. There can be no excuse for what they did. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts against both Michael and Catherine Henderson. As the foreman read the verdicts, the courtroom was completely silent, except for the quiet sobbing of some of the victim families who had attended the trial. On the count of conspiracy to exploit children, we find the defendant Michael Henderson guilty. On the count of racketeering, we find the defendant Michael Henderson guilty. On the count of money laundering, we find the defendant Michael Henderson guilty. The litany continued for both defendants, guilty verdict after guilty verdict on charges that carried potential sentences of life in prison. When the final verdict was read, both Hendersons sat motionless at the defense table, finally understanding that their lives as they had known them were over. This verdict sends a clear message that our society will not tolerate those who prey on children. U.S. Attorney Stevens said outside the courthouse after the verdicts were announced. No matter how sophisticated their operations, no matter how well they hide behind professional respectability, we will find them and we will hold them accountable. The sentencing hearing took place 2 months later, and it provided an opportunity for the victim families to directly address the Hendersons about the impact their crimes had had on their children and their families. Judge Patricia Williams allowed unlimited victim impact statements, and over 30 families chose to speak. "You stole my child's innocence," said Mrs. Rodriguez, whose daughter Emma had been approached by a predator who had purchased her information from the Collectors Network. "You turned my neighborhood into a place of fear instead of safety. You made my daughter afraid to play in her own yard." The impact statements continued for hours, each one more heart